So now, Bonnie, we're going to open up our discussion, and it's going to be around our personal journeys inside big institutions or national institutions. Yourself with the British Museum, and myself working at the Natural History. And then after that, we'll lead into, other examples around Black history and a whole conversation. So, what's it like, the British Museum?
Well, we're not here long enough to tell that.
A summary of the experiences.
Well, I love that museum, so it's always good for me. And it's a very complex institution. I call it the Queen. So everybody's got, we say in Chicago, everybody got to come for the Queen. So she gets hit all the time, left, right, and center. So it's kind of interesting to be a part of that and to see her get hit a lot. So that's one of the experiences. But I want to tell a little story about you, and it's on me, about meeting you for the first time. Because people use the term decolonize, and I always say, well, what do you mean? I mean, one of the things that I really wanted to talk about tonight is language and how some things are becoming jargon and they don't have any meaning. They're losing meaning. Or meaning is being sort of passed around to different silos and so forth. But my decolonizing moment was when I was working on this podcast, doing the research, and one of the things I had to do was go and meet the principal curator at the Natural History Museum, called Dr. Miranda Lowe. So I'm like, okay, because I thought that was great. And what I'm used to in all institutions, not just museums, is I expected to meet a white person. And I didn't even know that I expected that. I didn't know that I didn't consciously know that I felt that way. So I'm ready for Miranda, and I'm going to be very general about this, so I apologize to anybody from the home counties, but I was expecting Miranda Lowe of the home counties, okay, with the whole thing, because the name, everything. And so I'm going up these stairs, and Miranda opens the door. Now, for 2 seconds, I thought, and I'm telling you, I mean, I couldn't even breathe almost all night. I thought, well, I was going to say to her, I'm here to see Dr. Miranda Lowe. Somehow it didn't come out of my mouth because Miranda started talking. And then I thought, oh shit, she's Miranda Lowe. Oh my God, my own brain, me, the black feminist, whatever, I have walked into this room looking for something else. My mind needs to be dealt with. I was shaken, and of course that left me open to what Miranda had to say to me, and because I was completely undone. So I couldn't come in as the interlocutor, podcast, BS, or whatever. I had to just stand there and be there, because this sister from the, South London, British Caribbean, working class sister, she just totally knocked me out. But that wasn't the end of it. So I'm like picking myself up off the floor, inside myself, and slapping myself at the same time, and trying to recover at the same time. Like when you're on the dance, you're dancing and you fall. You have to okay, I gotta still stay in this flow, although I've fallen. So I picked myself up, and she took me down to show who she was attached to in that museum. And I have to tell you, it was the most moving encounter I've had of all the research, because she showed me a little floral representation, and we're gonna talk about him, of Grama Nkwasi, the founder of quinine, the person who really helped, and who is considered a traitor among indigenous peoples of Suriname. He was a black man, and it says something to us, that we still have his name, because I don't have my ancestral name. We know Quasi is a Ghanaian name, so he had his name. So I had two little slaps upside my head that day, and I want to talk about that because that throws everything. And so I want to talk about why Black history is at a crossroads, because these kind of encounters have to be baked into the cake if we go further.
Of course. Wonderful. So shall I talk a little bit about me being in an institution like that? Well, it's my 30th anniversary next month, 30. Just thought I'd get that in there. And it's not been an easy journey. Where do I start? But I'll just do a potted history. It's definitely not been easy. It's not been easy from a female scientist point of view, female curator, because I do both, and that I'm Black as well. I also recently revealed to Bonnie that I was a very young single parent when I joined as well, and I don't talk about that because one of the things when I joined, that was at the back of my mind, going for interview and things like that, because you don't want, as a young Black person in general, you don't want people to, perceive you in a certain way. The way the media, about young Black people, in particular young Black men, but I was, a young Black female, extremely young when I joined the museum, and I was just there to just get a job. At school, I loved science. I visited, my parents took me to the Natural History Museum, the Horniman Museum, two local museums, around and about in South London. And all credit to them back in the 1970s doing that kind of thing, because it gave me the passion and the drive, and I'm a very curious person to know what's going on. And actually, one interesting thing is, it shows that I was born to be a curator of sorts. Because I love organising things, because my books as a child, I'd write my initials MM, and then it would be either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the size of the book for a start. But then, when I started at the museum, I realised that I had a young people's guide to the British Museum Natural History, that when I was 5 years old, I still had that, and how amazing that I'm working in that institution now. So born curator in that sense. But the museum had its challenges. When I joined in 1991, it was still very, as we use old school, very traditional. Colour-graded lab coats according to your seniority. It was still linked quite closely to the civil service. So I joined as an assistant scientific officer, which the equivalent grade now would be, or the job title, would be assistant curator. And I came from a medical background anyway, and then joined. I didn't have any zoological knowledge, but all the knowledge, and this, we're going to talk about valuing knowledge and systems of knowledge, westernised knowledge, all the knowledge was in-house. I was taught how to examine specimens, do the curatorial processes, preservation of specimens, writing at the time, handwriting in big old books, ledgers called registers. A lot of it's, it's all gone into computerisation. But I learned all those traditional things. I'd knock on the senior common room as a lower grade and ask for Mr. or Dr. so-and-so, those kind of, and that was 1991. Even down to somebody who retired 2 years after I joined said to me, Miranda, if you're lucky, you will get my office. And the reason why? It's because his office had carpet and he was a more senior grade. My office had lino, So all those kind of things. But for me, as a young Black person in the museum, as my mum always said, I just got my head down and did the work, the knowledge and all the rest of it, reading lots of books. As time went on, you kind of raise your head above the parapet a little bit more as you get courage, and you have various allies, but there's still that difficulty of how far you go. And I just want to bring you up to the current day, as it were. So there have been a lot of bumps along the way. You can ask me with a drink a bit later on of those. But I realise that currently I do tick a lot of boxes of what's gone on in the last 18 months. There are a lot of things, and we're going to talk about a little bit in terms of what does decolonizing natural history collections mean, because that body of work, which has come into the limelight in the last 18 months, I've been doing since 2007. I realised when all cultural organisations were commemorating the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade at that point in time, and I was, realising certain things, and I was documenting a lot of things, and, broadly, I visited a lot of collections, as well as looking at my own and realising, a lot of this information is not in the public domain, especially in acknowledgement of people of African and Caribbean heritage that had collected a lot of these specimens, what it meant and what it still currently means to the UK and worldwide, colonialism, the British Empire, all those kind of things. And within natural history, for me, it was natural history going under the radar, because the way things are documented, people have an emotional relationship to objects and the British Museum objects.
Yes.
But in natural history, things are classed as specimens, so they go under the radar. And so I've been talking a lot about, people's emotions and what they see as an object and a specimen. So there's a lot to reveal as we'll carry on discussing about natural history and their collections.
Can I add something, because I forgot, I don't know why. Currently, I'm back at the British Museum. I was on the board and for 8 years and deputy chair for 4. The director was Neil McGregor. And that was an incredible experience for me in many ways. Neil was a wonderful seer, and I was there helping. I organized, along with people there, the commemoration 2015. And I wanted to call it Resistance and Remembrance, and that's what we called it. And I'll never forget how the whole great court was filled with people who didn't come to the museum. And it was beautiful to see community people go down to the Benin Bronzes, go down there and teach from the community to the community, which is what a museum should be about. It was beautiful. People roamed around, they did their thing. And now I've returned at the invitation of the current director, Hartwig Fischer, who's an incredible human being. And for me, we're making together a project called the Era of Reclamation. And Miranda was one of our first guests in conversation with 2 other extraordinary women. One is Professor Olivet Otele, the first woman of African descent to be made full professor in history in this country, and Dr. Velika Smelders from the Reich Museum, but she wasn't at the Reich Museum at the time. Now she's become head of history at the Reich Museum, which is the post at the Reich Museum in which people are taught Dutch history. She's rewriting the Dutch Golden Age. She's the first person of Caribbean descent to ever be in that position in the Netherlands. And I like to think we helped her, because this conversation went viral in many ways. And so people ask me what diversity is, and one of the things is listening. Hartwig Fischer listens. The British Museum is listening. And that, to me, is what diversity is, and that's why I'm there now, to be part of the listening and also part of the doing.
Yeah. And I think I'd just like to say, in the last 18 months, a lot more museums have been listening. So, the British Museum, NHM, having 2 of us sort of
and the V&A,
within
I'm working with
V&A,
some things at V&A. People are listening.
Moving forward.
But it's got to be a little bit more than that now.
Of course. Right, so should we move on to the images and what decolonizing natural history means to me? So this is one special person. Where it all started for me, all those years ago in 2007, but more in the public domain in 2018 to now, is Graman Quasi. And as Bonnie mentioned at the beginning, you know, it's not often you find somebody in the mid-1700s that has been recognised as discovering medicinal properties of a plant and actually had the plant named after him by someone called Carl Linnaeus, who in scientific terms is known as well, they call him the godfather of taxonomy, so that's the naming of plants and animals. But he's the person, because naming of plants and animals happened before Carl Linnaeus, but he's the person who popularised it and whose scientists in the Western world still use that hierarchy and classification systems there. And so the link to the Natural History Museum with Graman Quasi is that when you walk into the main hall or the Hinsey Hall of the museum, if you look up, and next time you visit, be sure to look up, there are 162 botanical ceiling panels, and one of them up on the second floor balcony near the segment of the giant sequoia is an illustration of the plant called Quasi amara, named after Graman Quasi. And Bonnie, do you want to talk about your experience when I told you the story?
Well, one of the things that I really wanted to do this talk with you, Miranda, because you and I are politically incorrect. And we don't, we go against the template in some ways. I mean, you were a big activist as well in changing museums. I'm doing that with Hartwig in my own way, but we're both on paper incorrect. And that's one of the things that I wanted to bring this contradiction, I thought, to this group today, because we're in an age where, and we're doing rapidly categorization, we're doing lots of sort of putting people in silos, and your love and your respect for Grauman, and I also, I forgot his name, but there's another man who was at Elmina who worked for the Dutch as well, and he was responsible for helping baptize people and put my ancestors on the ships out. So these kind of stories are there. And you know, you have to ask, these are contradictions, you know, and I think...
Sorry, Bonnie, I just wanted to interrupt you there, because what we didn't say, or what I didn't say also, as well as Graman Quasi and this medicinal plant, he's controversial in the sense that he fought alongside the Dutch colonialists and got his ear, I can't remember which ear, must be like Van Gogh anyway, Van Gogh. And, you know, but, so in that sense, there's contradictions there.
And he went to Amsterdam, he was feted by the king.
That's right.
And among the indigenous people, you say his name, and he's a traitor.
Yeah, but he also helped heal both the colonialists and the indigenous peoples. So, but for me, it's about raising, acknowledging on the one hand, and raising all sides of the story to be told, because that currently, well, until, you know, I amplified the story, it wasn't in the public domain. And so we need to know about these things, because medicinally, you know, the chemical substances from that plant have been used all throughout the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm currently trying to kind of track all of that. And you just sort of think, you know, how much wealth for others has been built on that, as well as, you know, the difficult history there of him, you know, fighting against the Surinese people.
And one thing, Lonnie Bunch, who is now head of the Smithsonian, largest museum complex in the world, and a man of African descent, first African American to head up this institution, did a talk at the British Library about a year or two ago, and he talked about ambiguity. And he talked about somehow we've got to get ambiguity on the table with Black history. And you know, I don't know how do you do that when people are marching in the street, because ambiguity adds to the history the whole layer of a Grauman quasi. It adds to the history of, Africa, for instance. I mean, African empires, what they were like pre-encounter, all of these kinds of things. Ambiguity adds, and one of the things we're doing with Era of Reclamation, which I really would like to do, I mean, Harvig and I believe that the Caribbean is probably the most underrated region in the world in terms of just genius. And the genius in the Caribbean, the genius of Caribbean people is immense on every level. And also people on the Atlantic shore in in America. That survival of that middle passage, the kinds of things people had to do to survive, the way we are children of survivors, and the immense knowledge that these people had with them. One of the things I learned in doing the podcast was that it is possible. We talk about the Haitian Revolution, and we don't talk about it enough because, of course, we live in an Anglophone world. That is a lingua franca, so we don't talk about Haiti. We can't talk about Haiti. There's a lot of things that we can't have the conversation. We can't have this conversation a lot about South Africa in many ways because we don't have the language. And our language is the colonial language. But the other part of it, too, is that it is possible that we talk about Toussaint Louverture, and we talk rightfully, and that goes all the way into making Afrofuturism, where men are the lead. But we never talk about women. We never talk about the fact that the slave revolts were led by women, mostly on board the ships, because if you think about it, you wouldn't take an able-bodied man and put him on a top deck, you lock him down. So what happens is women were left on the top to be sexually abused and everything else, and they fought back. Lloyd's of London was founded because black women turned the ships around. It was called, the policy that Lloyd's of London used was called insurrection of cargo. And it is in this wonderful book. It's a graphic novel, but it's also about black women and slave revolts. And in Haiti, unfortunately for the French, they had captured what we call Amazons. These are women trained to fight. These women got enslaved in Haiti and they kicked butt. That's a lot of what happened in Haiti, and we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that one thing we're investigating in our curation is the possibility that Africans had a form of vaccination, that in fact they could make a way to immunize themselves against what's called the Columbian encounter, in which indigenous people met Europeans and were just wiped out because they had no immune systems. Africans survived. What do we know? What happened there? How did that happen? So it's those kind of investigations, along with the ambiguity of the Grauman quasi, who's part of that.
Yeah. So, this one.
My boy.
Yeah. The Cheddar Man. So, Bonnie, what would you like to say about that?
Well, we have an expert in the audience on reconstructing from skeletal, prehistoric skeletal remains, and so I got a nice tutorial on the fact that that's not what he actually would look like. In fact, the guys who put him together based on DNA and so forth, it was so funny, is they always make their reconstructions look like them. But this man undoubtedly had dark skin, we know now, and these things evolve.
Yes.
And we also know maybe, and again I defer to my sister here who's the expert, he possibly had blue eyes, which is a mutation from around what we used to call Hungary. And the fact that anybody who traces themselves back to that region, that is their ancestor, this guy. Also, up by Hadrian's Wall, when we've got a lot of objects in the museum around there was a Roman legion, a couple of them, from North Africa. We know the Roman legion was what we would call diverse. Mm-hmm. Those guys didn't go home. So there are a bunch of people up there who are carrying African DNA. And these are kind of things that I say when we talk about Black history, when we talk about looking at the contradictions and the conundrums and the bigness of it, these are the kind of stories we need to tell.
So before I go to my wonderful friend Alex over there, we also missed out the bit about the hair as well. So within reconstructions, there's always a Europeanized kind of hair, not anything that's like our current hair.
This is the hair, right?
So that's a very interesting point to pick up. But I'd just like to bring into the conversation Alex McKenzie, who's doing some reconstructions of her own on Cheddar Man, as well as a number of other things.
I started Cheddar Man.
Yeah.
Well, I worked in mannequins for 15 years, and there's lots of things that you learn when you make mannequins. But one of the things I always noticed was in museum displays that ancient human beings went from being monkeys to kind of weird brown Germans really quickly without any African people in the middle. So I thought maybe there's something wrong with the reconstruction method. So I've just immersed myself in forensic anthropology for a little while. And I think the reconstruction method is a German invention. And it's only, well, it's a couple of 100 years old, but it hasn't really been challenged in the sense that it's a method based on European dimensions. So the faces get, a German face gets plonked on any skull like a badly fitting jumper, basically. So, but also, you know, the whole, there's a lot about the prominent brow that I think we're accustomed to the image of the Neanderthal with a kind of hairy brow and a deep set eye, but actually I think that's incorrect in the sense that that particular, that eye and that brow is really modern, and actually I don't think Neanderthals look like that. I think that brow makes an Asian eye, and I think that brow makes a different shaped eye because I think the eyeball sits further forward. But I think there's a lot about reconstructing from ancient skulls that just needs examination, and I'm just running away at it. So I'm not really an expert, I'm just probably looking at something that hasn't really been looked at properly. And the thing that I'm most curious about is that whenever you go into a gallery display where they're showing ancient human beings, and if everybody came out of Africa, why don't they look African? Which I think is a bit of an elephant in the room. So based on that, I think there's a lot of knowledge that needs decolonizing. And you know, I think if you look at the history of books, and the printing press is only 500 years old, and in that time we also had transatlantic slavery. So there's a lot of human beings whose genius and expertise were not consulted, including Indigenous people. So I think there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot about ancient human beings that we are just not really looking at properly. So, yeah.
Thanks, Alex. And actually, that just makes me bring the link to, it's all about people being able, other than myself who's gained a certain kind of privilege of working a long time in the museum, access to collections, not just the curators, but you know, having multiple perspectives, many voices in the room to discuss and look at one object or specimen, to see the things. That's what happens in, you know, the pure science that I do all the time. Scientists critiquing one another and writing scientific papers and picking up different kind of characteristics. But what has to happen is that scientists are not just we're not just talking to ourselves in the same room, in the same way, but broadening it out, because there's many forms of knowledge, there's many ways of seeing things. When we go to an art gallery, a painting's hung on a wall, we walk around it, many different eyes, we see different things mean something to us, either of that person in the front of the portrait or in the background. What is going on there? What environment they're placed? What are they wearing? What jewellery? You know, I'm a scientist, so if I see a portrait wearing a red coral necklace, I know that's a semi-precious Carolian rubrine red coral. It means status. So it's all those kind of insights to help us decolonize.
But you know, I want to push back on that a little bit because I want to show the bending bronzes.
Oh, yes.
Them. And I got some of my Nigerian brothers in the front row with me to watch me. I want to talk about two things or three things quickly. One, I will tell you another story quickly. I came to know the British Museum because my father, my late dad, who grew up in rural Mississippi in the 30s during the Depression, Mississippi Delta, black. So, you know, the way he learned, he found out that he could vote if he could do the poll test in Mandarin Chinese. So he didn't vote. And a lot of people of African descent did not vote. My grandmother got him out of town because he would not get off the sidewalk when a white man came on the sidewalk. So my grandmother said, boy, you gotta go because you're not gonna be alive. So my dad came up north and was here during the Second World War in a segregated army, racially segregated army, and met a lot of what they called then Commonwealth officers. First time he ever seen a black man, a black woman in any kind of uniform. He was just knocked out by Jamaicans and Barbadians, you know, from outer space. As far as he was concerned, incredible. But the thing that I want to say about him was that he was an autodidact. He taught himself everything, and one of the things he used was the Encyclopedia Britannica, which he brought door to door. And in those days, I was a little girl, and we're talking about the end of the 50s. They were illustrated by the British Museum, illustrations. And in the illustrations were the Parthenon frieze, of course, another little controversial little piece of marble, and these beauties. And of course, looking at them as a girl growing up on the South Side, Geraldine knows what that's like, I fell in love with the place and I fell in love with the objects. And I lived in New York for a while, and I remember going to an exhibition in New York of Kenyan objects. And I looked at them and I said inside myself, what are you doing here? What are you doing here behind this glass? And they seemed to say to me, we're here because you're here. And then I began to investigate that. I'm still investigating it. But there is a beautiful theory going around now, and I'm not going to say this anthropologist, archaeologist's name. He's very eminent, and he will publish his own paper. But he talks about the stickiness of objects, that objects have, in the museum world we call these objects, they have a stickiness. And I was trying to figure out what's the stickiness. And I'm also working on a play about Frederick Douglass, and one thing that he said was, one thing that slavery did was the most unnatural act in the world. It decoupled people from their families. You had no family. You had no name. You came from nowhere. And when I looked in those faces, I saw my face. Now that's emotional, and that's a connection. Of course, I look in Landry and Amika and Kenda's faces. I also see their faces as well. I saw my face. I still see my face. I see my family. So it's very problematic for me emotionally, because the museum is an emotional experience for me. It's not a political experience. And the last thing I want to say about that is, it's interesting to me that the British Museum is now involved in the project at Edo State, in which it is helping to do a dig around the new museum being built by Sir David Adjaye. And the British Museum, the director raised $5 million to go and dig around Edo and see what else can go inside the museum. This museum is for the reunification of the Benin bronzes. Now, it would seem to me if people put two and two together, that means that these beauties are going to go home. But it's interesting to me that this story made no headlines. It did not make the press. Nobody talked about it. Nobody said anything. And this is what I'm talking about when I say people come for the queen. And it's interesting to me that no one has actually put those two things together, and it means maybe these are gonna go home. I'm not here to represent the British Museum, so I can't say for sure, but if they're building a museum to reunify well, I think that's what it means. So they are very personal for me. The icon drum, which is in the collection of the British Museum, which is the oldest African American object in existence, I'm very attached to too. So it's about my emotional connection, it's about storytelling, it's about the way I feel. I know the history, I'm absolutely aware of it. I know everything about history of how these objects came into the collection. And not just this collection, they are everywhere, everywhere. But I wanted to have this talk with you tonight and in front of this audience to talk about ambiguity, to talk about what happens in a museum, to talk about how I happen to be there as a descendant of enslaved Africans, how you happen to be where you are. In fact, I made a joke when I first met Miranda, and it's incorrect. I said, gosh, Miranda, two people like you and me, the only way we'd be in the Natural History Museum is specimens. So, you know.
I remember that. We were in the library.
Well, exactly.
And
You know, us two black women, we'd be in, like in a drawer somewhere. So we aren't, though. And I wanted to, I said, I really wanted to put this out to this audience, because what's happening now is that people are lining up and taking positions with no knowledge. I mean, like close to no knowledge, and no information. There was a piece that went out in a beautiful strand on Channel 4 a couple of weeks ago that they gave the day over to people of African descent. It was beautiful. The news part was a brother who decided that he was going to do not a news piece, but an editorial piece. And he went out trying to find out why the Benin bronzes in the British Museum were not returned. He didn't investigate it. He just had something to say because it came from his heart, and he had to say it. So why I say Black history is at a crossroads is that at some point, for the sake of our children and for the sake of our ancestors, we're going to have to find a way to get around a table and understand what we're talking about, and understand and get as much history as we can on that table, as much as we can have a conversation, as much as we can, as a global species, because we're all from Africa and we're all related. And so how do we do that now in the age, and I call this now post-BLM, because I think BLM has moved on. I think it's over. And we're in another space now. And we have a chance to define, well, not us, but the younger generations will have a chance to define and look at that space, because it's key, it's crucial.
Of course.
And that's the icon drum that is the oldest African American object in the museum, and I'm the second, I think, and there it is. and this drum, they thought was, when it came to the collection, they thought that it was, they knew what it was, but they didn't know what covered it. And now they've discovered that this drum, and this is research, was a dancing drum. In other words, they put the drum, they had a drummer on board the ship so that people wouldn't be depressed. That so that they wouldn't have broken hearts and die and not be able to make any money for anybody. So they had the drum. And the drum is covered with indigenous deer skin, but it is 100% a con. It's very moving. And I remember when I was at Elmina, and I was there before the tourist trade started, and I was told by the brother at the gate, the Ghanaian brother, my sister, you're gonna cry. So I went and was prepared to cry, because maybe my ancestors had come through there. And the last thing I want to say is, I remember going up to the ramparts at Elmina, and I looked down at the shore, and I saw that black Atlantic, and I saw those rocks. And I thought, I come from a hell of a people, because we survived.
Yeah. So, have we got time for questions? I don't know what time it is now. At the
Thank
moment.
you.
Yeah.
So we do have time for questions. So there's a couple of microphones coming around. Anyone? Okay, so there's one.
Always cry when I say that story.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a fascinating conversation and a journey back in history. I guess my question, I have many questions, but the comment that I'm going to ask you about is what you just mentioned about BLM. That is done, it's gone. What do you mean by that?
Miranda probably does not agree with me, but this is my personal experience, my personal take. Having grown up in Chicago on the South Side in Black Power in the 60s and working briefly with the Chicago Black Panther Party and all of that, and also in Black theater for my whole life. It has a feeling about it. And one of the things is, you can't ever make a movement if you don't know what went before. You can't make a movement if you think nothing had happened before. Because then that's when you get co-opted, that's when you get captured, that's when you get lied to, that's when you get coerced. That's when you think, oh, I'm a member of the television, United States, the Television Academy. So then therefore that means that they're gonna put some black folks in the acting category for the Emmys, and they did not. So that's what I mean about it's being appropriated because it doesn't have a root. And it came about because of a murder. But I'm old enough to tell you that murder is in a line of murders. And that should have been the analysis. Because when you make that analysis, then you know where to pick it up. See, folks, when they quote the "I Have a Dream" speech of Martin Luther King, which was an aside, which was impromptu, they never say what Dr. King said in the beginning. They never quote that part. And that's what I mean by Black history. The beginning of "I Have a Dream" is 100 years ago. Nobody talks about that because it's inconvenient. This takes a long, long time if we're going to make a change. And it takes people understanding that a system does not correct itself. It is impossible. That's a physics law. So for young people who are in BLM thinking they're going to get inside and change something, no, they will be changed. And that's the thing, that's what I mean by understanding how a movement comes to an end. It starts with a bang and ends with a whimper. And I'm concerned about that.
Question like that.
Hi, my question follows that. Thank you so much. Really, really brilliant. Thank you. How can we help? How can we help move on so we don't just go aside from
Say it again because you're disappearing. Your voice disappeared.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you very much, it was brilliant. Then how can we help? What can we do to really affect change?
Who is we?
All of us, the people we talk to, everyone here.
I used to say before BLM happened, and I used to do talks to big corporations, and I still do. I think it was Goldman Sachs. I told them, you want to make change? Go out there and get some of them brothers selling records in Brixton and put them in the front office. All they got to learn how, you want to teach them how to use the executive bathroom or whatever, show them the key. Them brothers got more brains than anything you can begin. You just have to learn how they talk or whatever. Just bring them inside. Just bring them inside. Let them deal and work in your organization. Don't send them through no process or nothing like that. Bring them in. Bring people in. Don't say, I'm making you head of diversity and you're going to be whatever. I mean, that's one of the things that's really joyous about being at the British Museum right now, because Harvey Fisher said, well, just come in. Here it is. And that's what needs to happen instead of going through all these things called diversity, because that's a con. Because you have to ask yourself, diverse from what? And diverse from whom? And I think what's so beautiful about what Museum Detox is doing, and Miranda as one of the founders and Lights, is the presence of these largely sisters inside museums, and being in there is the change. And then you just gotta know how to work with the change and be ready to surrender. Because folks come in, and I don't mean that in a battle sense. I always say diversity is listening. Just listen. It doesn't have to be, I have to put you in a category, I don't get what you're saying. Yeah, you do. If you listen, just listen. And I would say that's the first step, is to listen.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Bonnie has just said. You know, bringing people in, and I'm not really hot on diversity schemes or bringing someone in to be the diversity lead. We are more than that. Black people are more than that, and they have many skills to offer a lot of companies in many, many ways. I didn't come into the museum on a diversity scheme. I was looking for a job. I had the skills, I had the basic science, I didn't have the zoology, but they trained in-house. I came in, 2 years training, and then I became what the civil service called at that point an established grade. And that's what you need. And I just think it's appalling. I've been there 30 years, and people tell me, in terms of natural history, I'm the only black permanent female in the UK in natural history. This is crazy. It's like as if the cultural sector has gone backwards.
It has gone backwards. It has gone backwards. I've lived here since '86, and I'm telling you, it's gone backwards. And partly because people take names like BLM, and then what happens is they just market your name. They just market it. It just becomes like cigarettes or a t-shirt or a dance. They just market it. You know, it loses its energy, it loses its fire, because folks just market it. They just take it, they take it. And then they give a handful of people some gigs, and then that's the end of it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So hearing that is obviously definitely resonating. It's resonating with me. It's definitely resonating with me because you've had that kind of
levels of suffering, and you know, to a degree, obviously, my parents and grandparents have felt that on a different degree than I have. I'm second generation British, so they tell me stories, I can resonate with them, but not on the level of that kind of feeling that would drive you to make that deeper connection, to drive integrated change, not this kind of flash marketing thing that you mentioned as BLM, which some people have been shaken up. Yes, it has disturbed the conversation, but then it goes on to, okay, so what happens after? What happens when the hype has died down?
When the lights are gone,
When
the lights are gone, yeah.
How does that actually, what does that mean for real integrated change that's going to be not just a conversational topic, but not just about work and, oh, I can now see more people that look like me in the workplace, like where is it going to go next? And for me personally, my deep interest is, obviously it's resonating with me, I want to be a person to help that, and I think a lot of people do, but it's like, what are the actions that need to be taken? Listening is great, but then, and maybe there could be a cause of the, cause of the listening, actions taken because of listening, but there does need to be some kind of catalyst that actually drives that forward collectively, not in different directions, actually one direction with multiple assets at the end of it, tangible things that we can say, well, we know that change has actually been made, because we can feel it, we can see it, we're a part of it, and then we don't even need to say diversity anymore, because everything's already diverse. It's so subtle.
Yeah. You know, sister, I want to say, you know, when you see Renaissance painting, this may sound off topic, but I will explain. When you see a Renaissance painting, one of the ways that they highlight the paint is they have a little black child in it. And that's either the little servant or the whatever. And I think it was John Russell, and all of you who know, yes please, Ruskin, who said, the only reason that a black image exists in a Renaissance, black people only exist to be in Renaissance paintings. Now, what that means is, black people, even more than any other cohort, we never are supposed to get old. We're never supposed to have experience. We're always being developed. So I call it the empathication of people of African descent. So the business and everything else is always looking for developing, but you can't be already fully formed. Okay? You can't come and be a teacher. You can't be a leader or a thinker or an organizer. You got to be developed. So therefore, there is a cohort, a natural cohort, that's not going to have a lot of experience. If you're 21 years old, you have 21 years of life. You're going to do certain, so the sector and the intake is kept young so that they only have so much life experience. A Gen Z person only has so much life they've lived. A millennial, a late millennial, only so much life they've lived. You can't have experience and be black, because that does not exist. That's one of the reasons things don't change. So until the system can acknowledge that there are people of African descent out there who've actually lived lives, who may have actually done something, who may have actually affected something, we're gonna go marching back into history, backwards. And that to me is one of the revolutions, I think. If we can't, the fact that Miranda is in her position is absurd. It's literally absurd. It's absurd. And it's the way we should look at it. It's not a marching situation. It's absurd. And we should deal and look at these things as absurd. And then we have windows open for change.
I agree. I just want to add something there, though, that the systems do need to change, and we need to embed that change. And I have been doing that in my own organisation as well. I can't be driving everything all the time around change, you know, and what happens when I'm no longer there. So have to leave some sort of legacy, but also bringing the allies and saying, look, you're part of this too. You know, if we want things to change, you're part of it. But the other thing, I'm losing my train of thought now about
No, keep talking, baby. Keep talking.
And also, you can't just put people like me in organisations and expect everything to be okay, because they won't last that long. I'm not expecting people coming after me to continue to have that resilience that I have had to have. It's got to be easier, it's got to change, and we're all part of it. Because otherwise people leave after, and that's what I have seen. You know, we have student communities passing through the museum and other people, yeah, there's a certain economics around it, you know, people on short-term contracts. But despite all of that, you know, I've had younger black people in my organisation meet up for a coffee with me and say, look, Miranda, you know, they're like 2 and 4 years in, and they said, Miranda, I knew this would be hard, but I didn't expect it to be this hard. And for one of them, I've actually said this to them. I said, look, you're really talented and skilled, and if it's causing you that much pain, go somewhere else. As much as I want the change and the diversity within. And that's heartbreaking to have to say.
Yeah. Because you got to live your life.
Yeah, that's
you know,
exactly
you can't
what
be sitting up there
them.
knocking your head up against a wall. And you know, the problem is you don't see people of color who've had a career in these things. And it's not just, you know, there are people, of course there are, but as a cohort, as a normal, as the way, and this is just not in museums, it's everywhere, okay? Yeah. They just ain't, you know, you're walking in, and of course, if you're inventing the wheel all the time, the person who's got the car has got the power, all right? So you come in there all the time inventing the wheel, and there isn't any history, there's nothing there. The driver, you ain't in the driver's seat. And listen, I've told young people of color, don't stay. You know, because you gotta live. I mean, you know, but it's really interesting being there at the British Museum for me now. I love being there now. I love being there then. I love being there now, because I get to meet not only colleagues, I get to meet younger colleagues. I'm hearing them. I'm listening to them. I'm hearing what they say. And my job is to make, as they say in the Bible, the way straight as much as I possibly can, so that you don't have to do what Miranda had to do, because we don't have time for that.
Exactly, it's the time. It's
we
the
ain't
time.
Got the time.
Don't have the time.
Kenneth.
Miranda, well, thank you so much. This is fascinating.
And you and me been through some things.
I guess I have a quick observation followed by a question to you both, which is, I'm a school governor. I live in North London, but I'm a school governor in a school in South London. And, you know, I'm very conscious of the fact that we have a black head teacher. There are so few black head teachers. There are very few black governors. You know, 5% of school governing bodies have, you know, so there's a real imbalance right through society, and education is one of those places. Now, of course, we've signed up to the Lewisham Race Equality Pledge. We're talking about decolonizing the curriculum. For me, my personal feeling is that word is not the most helpful word.
It is a bad word.
We were just talking about this before. It pushes a button which suggests we're getting rid of things.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly.
I can understand why people immediately feel, you know, anxious and defensive, because they think that things that they love and value are just going to be thrown out.
Yeah.
Of course, I think our intention is to amplify, is to tell an inclusive history, is to give visibility to people and stories that have been neglected or been just completely overlooked, as you've illustrated, you know, this talk. So I guess my question, if there is one, is Is there a better way to talk about it? Is there a better word? I think it's not about right and wrong, but just that people understand what the intention is.
I've been looking into better words like reimagining and all sorts of other things there. The reason why I used it way back when, because I could see this word becoming popular.
Exactly.
And I thought, okay, no one's paying any attention to natural history and the stories and the histories that lie within. So I used it as a hook. Because I know, in the true sense of the word, that's not decolonizing. But it's a way, like you say, amplifying and acknowledging those histories and those stories around black people contributing. So yeah, I'm currently in discussions with museum sector people about other words. But then I'm sort of thinking, well, I don't feel, I mean, everybody, I don't feel that way about it, quite edgy and, you know, kind of nervous. But that's because I know of all the other things that it means within.
I mean, it's become jargon.
Yes.
That's what you're saying,
Yeah,
Kenneth. The word is correct, but it's become GB News, you know, and then it's suddenly, you know, it trends and it means nothing.
Yeah.
And what I try to tell when I work with people, they talk about decolonizing, and I feel very comfortable with all of you, so I'm going to talk like I do when I'm back home. You know, I'm going to say, I say to them, y'all realize you're part of the decolonization thing, don't you? What do you mean? What do you mean? I said, look, colonialism is under your feet. You walking on it. You can go and tear a statue down. What you gonna do about the tube? And not only that, I have a bunch of little, I call my posse. I said, investigate Battersea Bridge for me, because I want to know about Battersea Bridge, okay? So they did a little work on Battersea Bridge. Now, if you're from Jamaica, you should be pissed off about Battersea Bridge, okay? But nobody talks about that. They want to talk about taking down the statue of Colson. They want to bust in the British Museum and take down it. But what about the tube? What about, see, it's if we're going to decolonize, we need to realize that we're still in the colony. We are part of the colonial thing. We still are. And assess that. You know, assess it. I don't have a solution, but assess it. Don't make jargon and then don't even know what you're talking about. It's like, assess what you mean. Britain, London is largely a Victorian edifice. And where did all that stuff come from? Where did all that stuff come from? It's Neo-Georgian. Where did all that stuff come from? That's the first place we begin to really look at the homes we live in, the tubes we take, the buses, the roads. It's all colonial, just about. And if it's not directly colonial, then workers, British workers who were just flogged to death practically, no wages, nothing, built a lot of that stuff using materials from the colonies. So that's the next step I want to take people on, is to be able to have that history in a proper way, reconcile our own individual positions within it, and then we proceed out to to effect the justice and the truth that we all want to effect. But first we got to look inside the house, and we got to clean the house. And then when we do that, we can turn out and deal with everything else. This entire island, these groups of islands exist. We are in a colonial, post-colonial, literal infrastructure that we need to come to grips with, and we need to tell the truth about, and admit that we can't do without it, because we can.
Kenneth, I was just as Bonnie was speaking, I was just sort of thinking also, or reflecting, that even if we change it to another word, the issues remain the same. So, got to change, make change.
Yeah, I'm a governor of a school too. I'm chair of governors of our school, and we changed our school's name after BLM because our school's named after a person who inherited the deeds of the plantation. But that's a bit of a pretty bow on the issue, really. And the issue really is that our school particularly is chronically underinvested. So we're in the middle of a community that suffered from chronic underinvestment, and I complained about it to the borough today. I said, it's all very well changing our school's name, but
Thank
actually
you.
what we need is investment.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we are doing, or the kids' homework for Black History Month, because I challenged the head teacher, and we have a black head teacher, and at least 50% of our governing body is, from different backgrounds. I'm the only one. But a lot of it, for me, is about how Black history is framed. And slavery is a really small proportion, but it informs a lot of our present lives. But, white children learn about kings and queens and people who win wars and things like that. And so I said, why don't we have African kings and queens as our homework for Black History Month, and maybe we could park slavery for a bit and learn about expertise and genius and all sorts of
And
other
ambiguity as well with kings and queens.
Yeah, but like kids much more fun to dress up as kings and queens.
Exactly.
You don't have to wear the heavy stuff.
Exactly.
It's much more fun to kind of.
So they're little
imagine.
ones. They're little ones.
Yeah, they're little. It's primary school.
Oh, okay.
So they don't need to wear the heavy stuff just yet because it's too much, and actually it divides young people when the first thing they learn about Black history is slavery. That's actually.
And probably don't learn it right.
Well, yeah.
See, that's the other problem.
Exactly. So that's what we're doing in our school. So.
There's somebody who's got yes.
I want to talk about another governor story, but I'm a governor too. This whole, I'm the only person of colour on the governing body within a school which is predominantly white children because of the catchment, but surrounded within a very diverse areas. And we've had some interesting conversations about the approach of, celebrating diversity. And there's this question of, well, we should try and celebrate it throughout the curriculum all the time, sort of weave it in to the teaching throughout the year rather than doing this thing of Black History Month. Why should we do just Black History Month? And I was like, well, we celebrate moms all the time, but we still have Mother's Day. So that was sort of my take. I was like, well, I think it's important to have that month. So I don't know if this is a silly question for you, but what do you think about that approach? Should we be having these, days or months of Black history? Does that actually further the cause, or should we really be thinking more holistically about it throughout the year, or the years, or life,
Well, one thing is, and this is one thing I say about this book, and I think Miranda would, if you don't know Black history, you don't know history. First of all, you just don't know it, because it's a big hole that you haven't got. So that's the first thing that I would say, is its history. It's history. Okay, so that's the first thing. And the second thing, what I used to do as a teacher, I think you should always, with children, and the children, or the young, I think children deserve to be delighted. I think you should delight children. It's, for instance, right now, the richest man who ever lived is Jeff Bezos. The richest man who ever lived before Jeff Bezos was an African man. And he astounded Europe. He did a Hajj, and he came with all of his wealth. And until him, after him, there was nobody. It was Jeff Bezos. I would put them up on the board, and I would say, here they are. And then tell the story of the kingdom that he was in charge of, tell the story of the Africa that he lived in, tell the story of the wealth and how astounding he was to Europeans, Venetians. The Venetians thought he was a god. Just tell it with as much delight and wonder as you can, and it won't be weird. It'll be like, oh wow, we didn't even know this, and also some info for them, because Jeff Bezos, there was somebody richer than him. And those kind of stories, and tell the story. When we did this podcast, one of the most moving experiences I ever had was Michael Olujuru. I always mess up African. Michael Olujuru, who runs a project around John Blank, who was the trumpeter of Henry VII and Henry VIII. And in fact, John Blank is the first image of a person of African descent in Europe. And Michael has taught, and Michael has a little program to show how John Blank was the trumpeter of Henry VIII. In fact, he did the trumpet for the tournament in which Henry VIII celebrated the birth of his son who died. And so I had the privilege through Hartwig and the British Museum with Michael to go see something called the Westminster Tournament Roll, which is parchment, which tells the story of that tournament. And it's kept in London, I forgot the place, College of Arms, and you can't see it. It's not open to the public because it's made of parchment and it's a natural living thing and more people come to it. But they took it out for us. It was the most moving thing for me, because to look at John Blank, this black man in this tournament, the only black man, but what was so beautiful about him, somebody must have looked at his face. He didn't look like a white man. He didn't look like a man who, was colored dark. This was an African man. And he had a special cap on, so he was obviously proud. He is gorgeous. And that's the kind of story we need to tell. One of the other stories, the other way we know John Blank is because he found out somebody was getting paid more money than he was, so he sued. And that's how we know who he was. We know, for instance, that Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, which sunk at Portsmouth in the presence of the king, all hands on deck died. The king wanted his guns because that's for him, the most valuable thing. So he had some divers go and get his guns. They came from Venice, and history tells us that they were Italian. They were African, and they were stationed in Venice. And these are men who did deep sea diving with no equipment. Nothing. So all these myths about black folks can't swim, I don't know about that. And that's another story to tell kids. Black people retrieved that. A black man was, and also that the Holy Roman Empire considered one of its selling points was that it called itself multicultural. So it wanted to fight against the coming of Islamicism, it was this other battle. So they advertised black people. So you see all these statues of Saint Maurice. Saint Moritz in Switzerland is named after him. Mauritius is named after him. He was a superstar, and he was black, and he's all over Europe, as is the Black Madonna. The one symbol that all European countries have in common is the Black Madonna. So these are kind of things that we can tell kids, and it's delightful for them, and it fits into everything else that's there. And I would say, do Black History every month, at least, a couple times a week.
Thank you sincerely, Miranda and Bonnie. It was we're all about creating kind of positive impact here. So in that respect, it's great that there were so many school governors in the audience. Really some transferable impact in the wake of this discussion. But really, all that leaves me to do on behalf of the conduit is to thank Miranda and Bonnie for their time and to encourage you all to come up to the third floor for a drink with us.